Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Daniel Chua. I'm the Director of the Faith and Global Engagement Initiative here at the University of Hong Kong. A very warm welcome to you. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many of you here. Now, you've just been listening to Pharrell Williams' runaway hit song, Happy, with the line that goes, clap along if you feel that happiness is the truth. Right? Yeah, I can also do Michael Jackson and Lady Gaga. Now, it's a very perceptive phrase for our culture. Happiness is the truth. Because in many ways, both the intellectual enlightenment in the West and also the mystical enlightenment of the East is about this pursuit of happiness. And as far as Hong Kong is concerned about the pursuit of happiness, we apparently rank near the bottom of the happiness index in Asia. So just look at all of us here. We are profoundly unhappy, miserable people. So turn to your neighbor and say, cheer up. That's better. Now, and I don't know whether it's true that we're so unhappy. But if happiness is the truth, as Pharrell Williams tells us, then the big question is, what is true happiness? If happiness is the truth, what is true happiness? And that's the question we'll be looking at today at this event. And we're honored to have as our speaker a very well-known author, Philip Yancey, who will explore this question from the Christian theological tradition. Now, many of us would like to think that Philip Yancey is actually Chinese, named after a very great river in China. But actually, he was born in Atlanta, and he studied at Wheaton and the University of Chicago, and for much of his early career was a journalist in the States. Now, he really doesn't need much of an introduction, because I'm sure that more than half of you here have probably read a book by Philip Yancey. He currently, I think, has something like 15 million books in print and translated in 35 different languages. So, Philip, it's a great pleasure to have you here at the University of Hong Kong. Now, to gain another perspective on this issue of happiness, we thought it would be illuminating to hear from another tradition as well, a religion that embraces the idea of happiness as one of its core beliefs, Buddhism. So I'm also delighted that we have Dr. G.A. Somaratne, assistant professor from the Center of Buddhist Studies, who will give a very short introduction on the nature of happiness in Buddhist thought. Dr. Somaratne received his monastic training in Sri Lanka and his doctorate in religious studies at Northwestern University. So there is a great deal that we can learn from each other in these two religious traditions. And I'm very happy that both Dr. Somaratne and Philip Yancey are going to work together in harmony and counterpoint here to think about this issue. So we will begin with Dr. Somaratne giving a 10-minute presentation on Buddhist thought and happiness. And then Philip Yancey will come and give his talk, and hopefully we'll have time for Q&A. So without much more ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Somaratne onto the stage. So please welcome him.
Dear professors and Professor Daniel Chua, and ladies and gentlemen, and our chief guest here today, Mr. Philip Yancey, and Madam also. Yeah. So I am very delighted to have this opportunity to say a few words on happiness in Buddhism. Sort of I put it as a Buddhist perspective because there are various opinions on it. So happiness is correlated, maybe related with unhappiness. Humans experience both happiness and unhappiness. So this human world is, or humans are with the nature of experiencing both happiness and unhappiness. So this fusion tells us that these happy and unhappy feelings arise and cease, do not last long, are temporary, subject to change, and also could be changed. with our effort and will. So we need not suffer all the time. There are various types of happiness recognized in Buddhism. Today I would like to introduce two types here: mundane happiness and supramundane happiness. So, mundane happiness consists of human happiness and also divine happiness. Divine happiness here means the deities or gods, because Buddhism recognizes some heavenly worlds. So, in both places, we experience sensual pleasure, and that is what we call happiness. Uh, and, and supramundane happiness is non sensual, and it is understood as nibbana, and it is not a matter of feeling. According to Buddhism, the supramundane happiness is the highest happiness. There is this problem here. Happiness arises depending on many conditions. When we are happy, that happiness is supported by many other factors, which are themselves being conditioned by some other factors, and is occurring in a net of interconnected things. So, when something goes wrong, somewhere in the net, happiness changes. So these conditions includes both internal and external. So, for example, if we are living in a good political environment and social environment, then it helps us our inner happiness to grow. Happy feelings that we like to maintain all the time, but as it depends on other factors, we always fail to maintain it. This makes us sad, unhappy. So, unhappiness is always inherent in happiness. This is the reality of happiness. So, Buddhism also encourages us to understand the reality behind this sort of mundane happiness. So, therefore, try to achieve supramundane side. So there are two paths recognized to attain happiness. One is the path of acquiring that we all are pursuing. The seeker of mundane happiness moves towards acquiring possessions and holding into them. Uh, Actually, we are trying to be happy through sensual pleasure, and also we are attaching to certain views, and then both views and views also cause us a lot of problems and unhappiness. So this is the path to unhappiness rather than happiness. So if we think in terms of true happiness, what we pursue is really towards unhappiness. Path of abandoning, the seek of supramundane happiness moves towards from sort of abandonment of possessions and attachment to them. So this path is true happiness according to Buddhism. So that's why the Buddhism teach a sort of moderate life and restrained life, not really attached to our possessions, and also attached to our belief systems. So the morality and happiness are connected with each other. There is a necessary causal relationship between morality and happiness. That which morally good conduces happiness, that which morally bad conduces unhappiness. The mind full of greed, lust, hatred, and delusion suffers. The mind free from them becomes happy. True happiness refers to happy feelings that last, make us constantly happy, that we can return to again and again. Such happiness comes only in morally sound individuals. Happiness cannot be there if we are greedy, angry, and deluded. Greedy persons cannot be happy as she desires more and is always unhappy. Angry person cannot be happy as well because he is angry and living in hell. And deluded persons also, because if we are too much attached to certain views and things, that's what's now the world is experiencing, that in Syria and various other places is actually connected with this, because we are attached to certain views and without understanding our life and situations. Happiness is experienced when we are away from greed and anger. Giving generates lasting happiness. That's why social works and things are important. Stealing not. Saving a life generates lasting happiness. Killing not. Receiving another's genuine love and care makes one happy for long. Forcing another to make love will not. There are certain things that we can achieve. They could be attained by work, doing certain things. For example, there are 5 desirable, pleasant, and agreeable things in the world. They are rare in the world. They are sort of beauty, happiness, fame, and good rebirth. So Buddha says, I do not teach that they are to be obtained by prayer or by wish. If one could obtain them by prayer or wish, who would not pray and wish for them? So this means together with wish is also good, but together with the wish, but we need to have some sort of things that we need to do to conducive towards it. For example, Buddha says, for noble disciple who wishes to have long life, it is not befitting that he should pray for long life or take delight in doing so. He should rather follow a path of life that is conducive to longevity. By following such a path, he will obtain long life, be it divine or human. This same applies to happiness as well. So the Buddha says, abandon evil. O monks, one can abandon evil. If it were impossible to abandon evil, I would not ask you to do so. But as it can be done, therefore I say abandon evil. If this abandoning of evil would bring harm and suffering, I would not ask you to abandon it. But as the abandoning of evil brings well-being and happiness, therefore I say abandon evil. So as you say that abandoning evil gives you sort of pleasure and happiness. And not only that, cultivate the goods. O monks, one can cultivate the goods. If it were impossible to cultivate the good, I would not ask you to do so. But as it can be done, therefore I say cultivate the good. If this cultivation of good would bring harm and suffering, I would not ask you to cultivate it. But as the cultivation of the good brings well-being and happiness, therefore I say cultivate the goods. So what is this? What are these good about that Buddha is talking about? I don't have time here to. I think both Christians and you, we all agree what we mean by good, right? So present actions are central to present life more than to a life in distant future. With every moral action performed, the doer grows. So therefore, there is opportunity for us, to whatever we do. If we do with goodwill and good faith, and then that we could be happy, we could get generous because we are growing together with our actions. With every deed done, one has the opportunity to be happy. Whatever one does, by it one arises. The Buddha says. So we can be always fresh and new because we don't need to, even though yesterday we did some evil, it doesn't mean that we have to continue doing evil. Actions is really mental, so does the happiness. A good action performed purifies the state of mind, which means a happy state of mind. A bad action defiles the mind, which means unhappy state of mind. Not by that which is low, may the highest be won. If you want to be happy, you need to do good things and higher things. By doing low things, you cannot achieve it. By which is the highest, may be the highest be won. So happiness is something higher we desire, we always want to have. So therefore, this is the area that we need to have higher activities, supreme activities, super activities. So that is sort of good things and wholesome things. And so what we all agree, I think both Christians and Buddhists and Jews and Muslims and all, I guess. So there are two options left for us. One is to change the world to suit to our desires. So we cannot do it. So, but we can change ourselves, right? So therefore, Buddha and Buddhism, basically, Buddhist perspective is start with yourself and then try to change yourself, and it will help changing others. So how can we truly be happy? Or monks, bring the mind under your control. So the mind is basically where we feel happiness, and mind is central to Buddhism. So therefore, the Buddha is asking to control the mind. Do not be sort of a victim of the mind. So that is what Buddha is asking, and what I present here as the Buddhist perspective on happiness. So thank you very much, and I think I'm very happy to be in this forum because and if you have questions later, I can even talk to. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a very difficult task to be able to summarize this huge concept of happiness in less than 10 minutes. So a very big thank you for doing such a great job and with such clarity. So thank you again. It was wonderful. Thank you. I'd now like to invite Philip Yancey to take the podium and to share with us. So thank you again for coming. So please welcome Philip Yancey.
Thank you, Dr. Somaratne. And when I was first asked to speak on this topic, my wife said, "What do you know about happiness? You write books on pain and suffering, you're kind of melancholy." I said, "Well, but I married you, right?" So that's where I have learned about happiness. And I decided to agree to speak on it so that I could figure out what I was going to say. I often write books to figure out what I'm going to say about a topic, and I thought, well, here's a chance to think about happiness. And if I think enough thoughts, maybe I can write a book one day. Grace, who helped organize this event, put me onto the World Happiness Index, which was prompted by the Prime Minister of Bhutan. You may have heard he says we shouldn't be judging nations by the gross national product. It should be the gross national happiness. And so she sent me a link to this 172-page book that describes happiness around the World Happiness Index. And as Professor mentioned, Hong Kong doesn't rank so high. But the good news is you're actually higher than Bhutan. No, Hong Kong is number 72 of the 158 countries. So kind of right in the middle. And then Grace also sent me some links to local newspaper articles about how many depressed people there are. Am I not on? Is it? Okay. Got it. My fault. Are you happy now? Okay. Yes. Grace also sent me a link on articles here in Hong Kong that showed how depressed especially secondary students are, and the very sad suicide rates that sometimes occurs here. Well, how do we judge happiness? The World Happiness Index judges it by things like prosperity. You have to have a minimum amount of prosperity, take care of your basic needs, freedom, generosity, corruption or lack of corruption, economic status, life expectancy, positive affect, what you look like if you have a little happy face, and also social support. And it was a little confusing to me because the country at the very top was Switzerland. And then Iceland was right behind Switzerland and Denmark. And clearly, positive affect has little to do with that. Have you ever been to these countries? I have spoken at these countries, and they sit there, they don't smile, they give no facial feedback, whatever. And then they come up afterwards, "That was the most moving sermon I have ever heard in my life." And I think, I didn't know you were alive. This is the first sign of life that I have seen. So it can be a little confusing. And then my country ranks fairly well. The United States ranks number 15, pretty good. But interestingly, Mexico ranks number 14. So here's a country that's much poorer than we are, not so high on the prosperity list. And you wonder, why do all those people from Mexico want to come and live in the United States? You know, they can be very happy there. We think we know what happiness is. And in fact, in America, we have that written into our Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness. We have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the American definition would be something like Disneyland. Wouldn't it be great to live in? And I found out you have one here, don't you? Yeah, okay. If you want to be happy, go to Disneyland. People are always very nice to you. They probably bow to you. There's no graffiti. You do have to wait in long queues, I must say that. But that is our view of happiness, being able to do whatever you want. So kind of the American stereotype of happiness would be sitting with a glass of wine, watching one of 500 cable television channels, or playing video games. Man, this is happiness, man. Wow, this is great. But it is actually quite a bit more complicated than that. Jesus talked about happiness most famously in a group of verses called the Beatitudes, and that's Jesus' prescription of happiness. And he said things like this. He said, "Blessed are the poor," not the rich, the poor. "Blessed are those who mourn," not those who are smiling, those who are mourning. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Those are imagine a politician trying to run on that platform. So he says, forget about the economy. It's actually good if you're in a recession because blessed are the poor, happy are the poor. And forget about the healthcare system because it's actually, you're better off if you're mourning, if you're sick. That's a better thing. And forget about trying to preserve rights for Christians. The more persecuted they are, the better. Happy are the persecuted. So it's counterintuitive, isn't it? And I am a Christian. I follow Jesus, and I have to struggle with some of those difficult things that he says. I, not knowing anything about happiness, started making a list of observations, things that I have learned over the years. And Dr. Somaratne, I was impressed how many have parallels in exactly what you have told us, the Buddhist version of happiness. So I'll just mention these observations I have made, and then I hope we have time for some dialogue and interaction. The first is that happiness must correspond to reality. And that's why Disneyland is not the best place for happiness. Because it's not real. Because in the real world, there is graffiti. There are people who treat you rudely. We just came, by the way, from Jakarta and Malaysia. I am so impressed with Hong Kong drivers. You are very polite. You let people in. You always wave thank you, few horns. This is a good sign. You may not rank high on the happiness, but polite drivers, you're way up there. I'm very impressed. And this is why American television is so seductive and deceptive, because it is promising all sorts of things that it can't deliver. If you just wear this cologne, women will come and fall at your feet. If you just drink this drink, even if you do no exercise, you'll lose 20 kilograms in a month. And we all know it's not true. And because we constantly get this message, if you only do this and it doesn't work out, our expectations get dashed. Because marketing is not reality, it's unreality. It's an unrealistic promise. And if you believe it, you will be disappointed. In fact, the more you raise someone's expectations, the more likely they will be disappointed. This is why I hate politics. I don't know if you know this, we're having an election year next year, and all of these, not a single person is talking reality. No one says, you know, it's a tough world, there will be some terrorist attacks, and we're not going to win all of our wars, and there may be a recession. Nobody says that. Elect me, and I'll solve those problems. And what happens? Well, 4 years later, we throw that guy out and we get a new guy because he didn't meet our expectations, or she, maybe, in this case. And it's a little bit like, do you remember when you first learned there was no Santa Claus? It's kind of a feeling of betrayal. You don't know what to trust. And the more we raise expectations, the less happy you'll be. In fact, you'll be disappointed because it doesn't correspond with reality. That's a huge problem in democratic and especially capitalistic countries. I have spent some time in India, and some of you are maybe from an Indian background, and you know about the caste system. And there are a lot of bad things about the caste system from my perspective. But one good thing is that it doesn't raise your expectations. Your expectations kind of depend on what caste you're born in. In America, we're taught, you too could be the president of the United States. You know, Abraham Lincoln, from the log cabin to the White House. Well, it's not true. There are a lot of people, including some running for Republicans right now, who should not be president of the United States. And we are not all qualified nor able to be president of the United States. And so you've got all these people who are disappointed because I was going to be president. Well, no, only one person can be president, not 300 million people. So capitalistic and very competition-oriented society, and I think probably Hong Kong is part of that. Chinese culture is a very competitive society where we judge our worth by how we rank, by how other people view us, by our tiger moms. That's how we judge our worth. So the first thing is that happiness must correspond to reality. And that, of course, was the story of the Buddha. The story is that he was insulated in a palace as a prince, and then he left the palace one day, and he saw things he had never seen before. He saw an old person. He saw a sick person. He saw a beggar. And he realized that what he had been told in the comfort of this palace did not correspond to reality. And somehow he had to incorporate the real world out there. He had been given a false view of the world. So that's the first observation about happiness that I came up with. The second one, I would say, happiness recedes from those who pursue it. Happiness recedes from those who pursue it. So if I had been asked to edit the Declaration of Independence, I would not have included the right to the pursuit of happiness, because pursuing happiness doesn't always get you happiness. In fact, quite the opposite. Often it gets you the opposite of happiness. I was just with Professor Chua in his office, the only professor's office I've ever been in that has a keyboard in it, and he is a musician. And I was thinking back to my own brother. Much of what I experienced as a Christian, even though I grew up in a very unhealthy church, I watched my brother take another approach. This was the 1960s. I know many of you, most of you maybe, were not alive in the 1960s. And you may have heard rumors about the 1960s. I assure you, all of those rumors are true. It was a crazy time, and it was a freedom time. Free love, free speech, free everything. And my brother was in university in the 1960s. He was an incredibly talented musician, professor. He could hear a song or even a concerto on the radio while he's eating dinner, and a month later sit down and play it perfectly. Just an amazing memory and ability to do that. So he went to a conservatory of music. He was there until his final semester. But this is the 1960s, and he wanted to be free. So he said, they can't make me graduate. And he dropped out the final semester. And then he wanted to free his mind. So he started taking a little drug called LSD. And he did free his mind, and he didn't have a career on the concert stage so that you would go see him play the piano. Actually, he became a piano tuner. He played the same note over and over. In some ways, in the 1960s, he was pursuing pleasure, every kind of pleasure, but he never found it. In fact, he found the opposite. I just came today from visiting with a person in Hong Kong I had heard about and knew about, Jackie Pullinger. Some of you may know her, who works with drug addicts. And addiction is a pursuit of pleasure, isn't it? It feels good. In fact, scientists who do experiments with rats, they'll have rats and they'll have a opioid type drug here and food here, and the rat has a choice. I could either eat food or I'll do the drug. And they do the drug, and they actually starve to death in pursuit of pleasure because they no longer are nourished. And in a sense, so many of our addictions start out as a pursuit of pleasure. We start out thinking they will serve us, but actually we end up serving them. So happiness can recede from those who pursue it. And you talked about the craving for sensuality. That is so appealing. And in Western societies particularly, you think of all the people in Mexico who have died trying to feed the drug habits of Americans who are pursuing pleasure, and it turns into a great evil. Happiness is fleeting. It's very hard to package. If there was a secret to happiness, and if we had a seminar so that I could say, okay, if you come today and pay $10, I will tell you the secret to happiness. Somebody probably would have come up with that by now, don't you think? There is no little secret to happiness in a package that I can give you. It doesn't work like that. In fact, it's usually a byproduct of other actions rather than something you pursue directly. It's fleeting. Think of famous people in my country. You'd probably know some of these names. Tiger Woods. Robin Williams, Michael Jackson, Amy Winehouse from Britain, Whitney Houston, and no doubt you could fill in your own celebrities. The rest of us look at people like that and say, oh man, wouldn't it be great to be Tiger Woods? I play golf. I say, oh, it would be great to be Tiger Woods. Wouldn't it be great to be Lady Gaga? And actually, as a journalist, when I've gotten to know these people, it's not so great. And if you look at how they ended their life, they realize that as well. There have been studies done on children of affluence, children of very rich people, and they are generally not happy because they don't know why they are living. They are living off of their parents' largesse. They have no meaning in their life, and often they mess up their lives. The same thing is true of winners of the lottery. I've read studies of the winners of the lottery, and you think, wouldn't it be great to win $1 million? And then people have followed up. Those people 10 years later, most of them don't have any of the money left. They're besieged by relatives and friends who say, could you loan me money? Could you loan me money? And a pretty high suicide rate, actually, among winners of the lottery. Happiness is fleeting. I read a friend of mine actually did a study of a group of monks. I know you studied as a monastic, and we in Christian religion have a history of monastics as well. One of the famous ones was a man named Benedict, and he lived in the year 600 AD, so that was 1,400 years ago, 1,500 now, I guess. And they studied the Benedicts, and they found it works like this. You have an idealistic, energetic, impressive leader, and that leader attracts people who respond to idealistic leaders, so a group of followers. Jesus had his disciples, Buddha had his disciples, Benedict had his disciples. I want to be like Benedict. So they came together to learn from him, and they created a community. And anytime you have a group of people who are highly motivated, energetic, and they're in a community, you have to have rules. And so he came up with the rule of Benedict, which is still followed by Benedictines all over the world today. It's a very impressive group of rules, actually, on the path to spiritual fulfillment. And as the person did this study, he said, okay, you've got a leader, you've got dedicated people around him, they form a community, they're disciplined. Whenever you have all of that together, you will inevitably produce prosperity, which ultimately destroys all that went before. And he did this study over the 1,500 years that Benedictines have existed. He said there's about a 200-year cycle where at first things go well, and if you study the original, the Benedictines were the ones who cultivated Europe, and they're the ones who did the illuminated manuscripts and kept scholarship alive during the Dark Ages. Very impressive people. Built cathedrals, monasteries. They did amazing things. But then after a while, they started thinking, why should we work so hard? We could pay some slaves to do this kind of stuff. And so they would sit in their nice monastery and drink Benedictine brandy, which they invented, right? And other people would be out there tending the grapes, and they would just sit there and get fat and, live the good life. And then about every 200 years, somebody would come along and say, wait a minute, guys, this isn't what Benedict had in mind. This isn't what Jesus had in mind. Somebody like a St. Francis of Assisi, a reformer. And call again what they were originally called to do. And he traces about every 200 years. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought, that's true not just of monastic orders. It's true of countries. It's true of cultures. As I travel around the world, I can see some countries are definitely on the upswing. And then I look at my own country, and frankly, because our ideal is to sit there with a glass of wine and watch one of 500 cable television, we're destroying all the rest. You talk to the old-timers in America, the greatest generation. Nobody says that about the millennials. Maybe they will. Maybe a new Benedict will arise and lead us the way. But right now, it seems to me, we're on the downslope in Western culture in general. Happiness is fleeting. It's hard to package, and it's hard to sustain. Happiness involves engagement. There are some pretty sophisticated studies of happiness going on, and it works like this. You get a little app on your smartphone, and you agree to this, and then they will buzz you, and on a scale of 1 to 10, you rate how happy you are at that second. And so then they ask details. What were you doing? Why were you feeling this way, either happy, unhappy, or whatever? And eventually, as they compile data from millions of people, they hope to find out, are you most happy when you're at the gymnasium or at Starbucks? We'll see. And one thing they have found already is that engagement, being engaged with your surroundings, is a key to happiness. About 47% of the time they find your mind is wandering. Probably right now, 47% of you have no idea what I just said. But maybe 53% do, because our mind is wandering. And whenever our mind is wandering, it creates this kind of mental splitness, this neurological splitness, and that's not a pleasurable state. Our brain doesn't like to be split. And one key to happiness is to learn focus. And in fact, a lot of corporate consultants in America are paid a lot of money to come and teach Buddhist mindfulness, because it's a way of bringing the mind together, so that when you eat a peach, you don't just go, blah, 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 blah. You think, oh, look at this peach. This peach is so beautiful. Look at the colors in this peach. And then you take that first bite and you feel it, drop by drop. That's happiness, right? And actually, it is. If you're just eating a peach in absence of mind, it doesn't even register. There's no pleasurable sensation. But if you pay attention to it, if your mind isn't wandering, it can be something like happiness. And that, I made a note, Doctor, when you were talking, you talked about the path of abandoning as opposed to the path of acquiring. And that came from Buddha, and it also came from Jesus 500 years later, because Jesus made one statement more frequently than any others. You may know there are 4 accounts of Jesus' life, the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there's only one statement where he said the same thing in different words 6 different times. So this obviously is important to Jesus. And what he said, and I'm paraphrasing a bit because there are different versions, but what he said goes like this: you don't find your life, or we could say find happiness, you don't find meaning, you don't find your life by acquiring more and more. That's the American way. It's not Jesus' way. You acquire your life, Jesus said, you find your life by giving it away in service to others. And then he showed us how. And that is so parallel to what you said about Buddhist understanding of happiness. And in these happiness studies, they have found out that volunteers who go and help serve in a soup kitchen, or all sorts of ways in which you can help people with need, volunteers have an improved sense of well-being. There's a Chinese proverb that goes like this: if you want happiness for an hour, take a nap. If you want happiness for a year, inherit a fortune. If you want happiness for a lifetime, help someone else. Yeah, very good proverb. That principle impressed me most as a journalist. I have interviewed many people over the years, and some of the people I call in the category of stars. These are famous people. They're the people we put on the covers of our magazine. So I've been able to interview 2 sitting presidents of the United States, Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter, some actors and actresses that you would know, some professional athletes that you would know, some great writers, John Updike, people like that. And forget I mentioned those names, but if I lump together all of those famous people, the ones that we fawn over, when I started, I really did think, wouldn't it be great to be one of those? Tiger Woods, Billy Graham, Lady Gaga. And as I have gotten to know them, actually, no, I don't, especially the celebrities, the Hollywood celebrities. One reason many of them become famous is because there's a little voice inside them that says, you're not good enough. Nobody likes you. So they spend the rest of their life trying to overcome that voice. And especially the comedians will tell you that. And I'm a nosy journalist, and sometimes I'll say, could I use your bathroom? And I'll go in there and look in the medicine cabinet. And I see how many pills it takes them to get through a day. And you know the marriage, divorce statistics in Hollywood, how some of them have 5, 6, pursuing happiness in a person and going out and acquiring more and more. And I read you just a short list of some people who actually ended their lives or ended their careers when everybody else thought, wouldn't it be great to be that person, except that person himself, herself. There's another group of people that I call servants, and increasingly as a journalist, I came to love finding those people. They didn't have the spotlight on them. They didn't generally make a lot of money. They worked in out-of-the-way places, and I spent 10 years working with a true servant. His name was Dr. Paul Brand. He was very distinguished. He was the top of his class at University College in London in medical school. And he spent most of his career, at least 25 years, working among the lowest group on the entire planet. There are a lot of disadvantaged groups. I guarantee you, you will never find a group lower on the scale than someone who is a Dalit, untouchable in India, an outcast who has leprosy. That's the bottom. They are not only rejected by society, they're kicked out of often physically kicked out of their homes, kicked out of their villages. And here was this brilliant surgeon. He had been offered to be head of orthopedics at Harvard and at Stanford University, and instead he turned it down to work among the lowest people on the planet. And you think it's hot here? Leprosariums, no one wants to live next to one. The only place that they could find for a leprosy hospital was this broiling gravel pit, this awful place. Nobody wanted to live there. And yet, I spent 10 years working with this man. I've never met anyone more full of gratitude for life, meaning, and fulfillment. And I look back on others that I have written about, and the ones that I want to be like, it's not the Lady Gagas or Tiger Woods. It's those who, exactly as Jesus said, you find your life by giving it away in service to others. A profound truth, a counterintuitive truth. We don't automatically think, I think I'll climb my way down. But actually, those who have done that, following Jesus, I have found Jesus was right. They not only gave themselves in service to others, in the process, they acquired their own life. They found their own life in a way that was totally attractive to me. Happiness often involves struggle, even suffering. And I learned that particularly from Dr. Paul Brand, because he was the one who made the discovery that leprosy, which is an old disease and a very feared disease, the only thing leprosy consists of is the death of nerve cells. The leprosy bacillus attacks nerve cells, particularly pain cells. And all of the abuse that you've seen, missing fingers, missing toes, they come because people do it to themselves because they no longer feel pain. I have met leprosy patients who lost all of their toes because they wore shoes that were too tight. And you know what it's like. You get a new pair of shoes and it's not comfortable, and so you put it aside and wait a couple days and you break it in, we say. Well, a leprosy person doesn't feel the pain, so they just keep wearing the shoe. They develop an ulcer, and eventually the toe just disappears. About a third of leprosy patients go blind because we've got a little tiny pain cell in our eyes, and the whole time I've been talking about, every 10 seconds you've been blinking. Some of you forget to open them after, but that's a very good thing, because a leprosy person doesn't feel that pain cell, so they leave their eyes open all day. They may reach up and scratch them like this, and they go blind. Their eyes dry out. And it was Dr. Brand who told me, we tend to think, he said, originally I used to think life is like two peaks of a mountain. One peak is happiness, and one peak is pain. Pleasure, pain. And he said, actually, it's not true, because my leprosy patients feel no pain, but oh, what miserable lives they lead. and I have known many of those patients. He said, actually, it's like one peak. And very often, it's when you're climbing up the peak, the difficult things that are most meaningful. Somebody came up to me this morning, just before I got up to speak, and said, could you write a message to my husband? My husband is running a marathon this week on the South Pole. Is that happiness? I have run one marathon. But unless you run a marathon, you don't know that feeling that you can only get from running a marathon. Janet and I have climbed, there are 54 mountains in Colorado over 4,300 meters, 14,000 feet. And it took us 15 years, but we climbed every one of those. Was it happiness? Well, getting up is not. But when you're at the top, you get a view you can only get by climbing the mountain. Dr. Brand was right. There's a single peak. And when you talk to Olympic athletes, as I've done, often what they do to achieve the top of that mountain is more like pain than pleasure. The training regimen they go through, ballerina, a gymnast, a weightlifter. I mean, look at them. Their faces are contorted. It's agony. But look at them when they win the gold medal. They're jumping up in the air. They've got a smile that would almost crack their face. It's a feeling you only get when pain and pleasure go together. I'll read you a quote by a Chinese philosopher, Lin Yutang. He talked about an ancient Chinese formula of 30 supreme pleasures. This is what he said. He said, in every one of them, pain and ecstasy were mixed together. He said, to be dry and thirsty in a hot and dusty land, and to feel great drops of rain on my bare skin. Ah, is this not happiness? To have an itch in a private part of my body, and finally to escape from my friends and go to a hiding place where I can scratch. Ah, is this not happiness? Each of the supreme pleasures in life, the 30 supreme pleasures that he mentioned, involved that mixture, that strange mixture of pain and ecstasy, which, as I go back on the Beatitudes, when you first read, happy are the poor, happy are those who are persecuted. What is Jesus talking about? What was he thinking? But actually, think of the other things I've said. Happiness involves engagement. It involves reality. It involves struggle. And Jesus is actually describing a pretty sophisticated view of happiness that incorporates so many of the things that I have been talking about. Studies of older senior citizen British people in London especially, they've done studies on what was the happiest time in your life. And over 60% of them say it was during the Blitz, the bombing of London in World War II. Now, during the Blitz, I think of my own country, we lost 3,000 people in the World Trade Center bombing. And I mean, that changed the world. Now it's crazy to have to fly on an airplane. We went into mourning, grief. We started a war. This had major ramifications. Some nights during the Blitz, 3,000 Londoners every night would die. And now they're looking back on that and say, this is the happiest time. What do you mean? What do you mean? Oh, well, it was hard, but we pulled together. The air raid siren would sound. We would go into the tube, and we would sing patriotic songs, and we would help each other, and we would nurse the wounded and the princes, and sometimes the queen would come and visit us, and we were happy. We were together. We were fighting evil. We had meaning to our lives. A sophisticated view of happiness. Happiness involves right living, and Professor Somaratne said that very clearly. Indulgence doesn't produce pleasure, and neither does denying all pleasure. There have been Christian ascetics, we call them, who do that. One guy lived on top of a pole for 18 years. People would hand him, bread with a little rope. He'd get bread and water. People live in caves. Sometimes they'll seal up a cave and just have a little window like that. And the Buddha himself attempted that for a while. He tried a very ascetic existence, and he actually almost died. Some people had to talk him out of it. And he came up with what he calls the middle way. We have our own middle way as Christians, and each of us has to find that for himself or herself. And one difference between what I believe as a Christian and what I understand Buddhists believe is that we have a very strong belief in a personal, loving God. And Buddhists see things a little bit differently. And we have certain problems as Christians that are very difficult. One of the problems is, okay, if you believe in a powerful, personal, loving God, why do bad things happen? Why are there tsunamis and disasters? And why are there children with leukemia? Why do these terrible things happen? That is a real problem. The very first book I wrote is a book called Where is God When It Hurts? And the second book I wrote was a book called Disappointment with God. And one of the most recent books I wrote was a book called The Question That Never Goes Away, because it never goes away. And I spent 4.5 hours a few days ago in Malaysia talking about the problem of pain and suffering. I'd be happy to do that, but they asked me to talk about happiness here. So, but I'm not speaking for Buddhists particularly, but especially for some of the militant atheists who are getting a lot of press these days, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, they will often use the problem of pain as a reason not to believe in a personal God. And that is a problem that we have to deal with. But I have a question for them, and it's the problem of pleasure. Where did pleasure come from? Because so many of the things that give us pleasure don't necessarily increase our survival mechanisms. They're not very Darwinian. They're the beauties of this world. As a mountain climber, so many times I've turned a corner, I've seen a carpet of wildflowers. And I think these were here whether anybody noticed them or not. Or I have not scuba dived, but I've snorkeled the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And there are more beautiful things floating around in that water than in every art museum in the world put together. And yet very few people saw them until Jacques Cousteau invented scuba gear in 1950. And now we know that they're there. And I believe that God lavished this planet with beauty. It's one of the things that brought me back to faith, because I was raised in a strict church. I didn't be like one of those people. Didn't want to be like. My brother went one direction. I did not want to be self-destructive in the path that he took. And actually, I keep saying there are three things that brought me back to faith. One was the beauties of nature. One was classical music. And one was romantic love. Those three things. And my image of God was this scowling kind of policeman trying to keep us from having a good time. That was what I came away from childhood. But then I found, no, quite the opposite. God is a God of the Father of all good gifts, as the Bible says, a God who has lavished the planet with beauty and goodness and pleasure. And Jesus himself said, I came that you would have the most abundant life to the fullest. And it was in those days when I really didn't know what to believe that I came across a quote from G.K. Chesterton, who said, the worst moment for an atheist is when he feels a profound sense of gratitude and has no one to thank. And that's how I felt. I wanted to know who to thank. I wanted to know the artist behind the wildflowers, behind the tropical fish, behind love, just a taste of which I had. One other difference and I'll make this my last point, one other difference between the Christian, distinctive about the Christian view of happiness is that we do believe that that we will never attain final and eternal happiness without help. In fact, we believe that the planet is so messed up that it will require a radical intervention by God, a remaking. It's foundational to what we believe. And that's why we emphasize the resurrection of Jesus so much. Because for us, the cross, of course, is the symbol. You see it on churches all over. For us, it took the worst thing that could happen. God sent his son to love the world, and instead the world killed him. But God was able to wrest out of that day something that we don't call Dark Friday, Tragic Friday, Sad Friday, but Good Friday. And that is the template that we believe will happen to all of creation. The world is good. The things I've described that brought me back to God, these are good. The world is broken. The world is messed up. And we believe it will take a radical intervention by God. I have studied a little of Buddhism. I admire the mindfulness. I admire the mental state of dealing with evil and anger and emotions and things like that. But we Christians believe there are some things that we just can't fix on our own. We need outside help. A couple of years ago, I was called, because I wrote a book called Where is God When It Hurts? I'm often called to places that are undergoing great suffering. The tsunami in Japan, school shootings, Virginia Tech. And I was called in December, right before Christmas, a couple of years ago. You may have heard of a school shooting in the United States where a crazed gunman in Connecticut, Sandy Hook, went into an elementary school and killed 26 and 7-year-old children. And a pastor there called me and said, our community is just in such grief. Could you possibly come and speak to them on Where is God When It Hurts? And I'm not even a parent. We have no children. And I asked myself, what could I possibly say to bring some comfort, some solace to those grieving people who had kissed their little children goodbye, put them on the bus, and then later that day had to go to a morgue and identify their bloody bodies. I happened to be writing an article at the time about the new atheist, and I had read books by Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, and they said things like this. They said that the universe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And that didn't square with the reality that I saw. I did see a difference between good and evil. And I wasn't seeing blind indifference. I was seeing an outpouring of compassion. And even the New York Times, secular organ, they weren't running articles by Richard Dawkins. They were running articles by priests and rabbis and pastors. Because at a time like that, we need comfort. And I had written a book called Where is God When It Hurts? And it struck me that maybe even a harder question is, where is no God when it hurts? If we only believe the universe is, as they said, like a match that flares up and then disappears. It is true that as adults we can learn to control much. We can learn to control our own bad impulses. We can, in some cases, learn to control even evil. But I needed a word of comfort to parents who had just lost their 6-year-old, their 7-year-old, who would never reach that state, who had never had that opportunity. And as a Christian, I stood before them and said, there is evil. You have seen it done here. But we believe that this is not the end. We believe that we have a God who is a God of strength and mercy and compassion, who has promised to remake this world, some things that we cannot do on our own. We need something bigger than ourselves, bigger than our minds. We need outside intervention. In the end, I guess I would have to conclude that a state of complete happiness in this life is unattainable. I can't package it, we can't even bear it in a sustained, consistent way, and we won't be able to until, as Christian, I believe, God heals the broken world. We have little glimpses, little hints, little clues, but nothing, it's always qualified, fleeting, in the midst of others who don't share our beliefs. And I'll conclude by quoting C.S. Lewis, who many of you have read. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. The pleasures in life, Lewis says, are indeed good, just not good enough. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. Thank you.
Philip, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I think we have some time for questions.
We do.
I should just mention that Dr. Somaratne has to leave early for a meeting, so he won't be on stage with us, but he might ask some questions if you have some here. So we have about maybe 15 minutes or so for questions. Just 3 rules, A, B, and C. A is please be articulate. We have 2 people with mics, so make sure you have a mic before you ask your question. And when you ask your question, please be really clear, have a real question. Secondly, please be brief. That's B, be brief. And this is really to the pastors among you. This is not really a time for you to give a sermon. You ask your question. So please give a very short, sweet, sharp question. And finally, C, be centered. That means please focus on the issues that you heard about today in this talk. I know there are many other questions you might want to ask the speaker today, but this is not the time for it. Just please focus on the issues about happiness today. So Philip, maybe you'd like to...
Yes, Daniel, I wonder if it would be appropriate to allow Dr. Somaratne to respond and see,
yes.
especially if I have misrepresented Buddhism in some way, I would love to have him a chance.
Are you willing to do that?
To correct
Would
that.
you like to do that? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think I agree most of the talk at the beginning part. Last part I don't agree because it's about the God and then the involvement of, and so that unless that the rest of the things I think both Christians and Buddhists can agree, because all these things what he mentioned about engagement, struggle, reality, so all we can agree. So but last part there are some problems. I need 1 hour to talk about it. So.
Well, you live here. They may be able to arrange that. Thank you, sir.
We'll continue the dialogue. But if you have some questions too, please ask as well. So we have some time for questions. So put your hands and I'll try to sort of range around the room a little bit. So yes, there's a question here. Why don't you have my mic first? Yeah.
So can I? Mr. Philip Yancey, thank you very much for delivering your talk. It was very, very. I enjoyed your talk very much. I have a question for relationship between freedom and the true happiness, because hearing your example about your brother, he seems to lost happiness because he pursued his maximum freedom by dropping out of college, and those people who won their medal, they enjoyed maximum happiness because they voluntarily restrict themselves while they undergo discipline for becoming an Olympic gold medalist. So do you think that by voluntarily restricting our freedom, can we attain true happiness?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. One of the things I remember from Dr. Paul Brand, he met with the top health people in the United States for a weekend. I think it was actually in Las Vegas, Nevada, where people go to find happiness and usually come away disappointed. But they had the Surgeon General of the United States and the head of the National Institutes of Health and all these people. And the goal of the weekend was to agree on the top 10 health problems facing our country so that they could devise a health policy based on the actual needs. And they debated, they had a whiteboard and they debated back and forth, jockeying for position. And Dr. Brand, who had lived most of his life in India, now lived in the United States. When they finally agreed on the top 10, he noticed something. Number 1 was smoking and tobacco-related illnesses. About 1,000 people a day die in the United States because of things that come from smoking. Number 2 was alcoholism, and that included fetal alcohol syndrome and drunk driving. Number 3 was violence, especially gun violence, drug addiction, sexually transmitted diseases. He went down the list. And he noticed all of these were things that we do to ourselves. We do too much. We smoke too much, we drink too much, we have sex with too many wrong people. all of these things. And he said, in India, I have been in similar situations like this, and these things wouldn't even exist on the list. It would be at various times, yellow fever and polio and smallpox, and gradually they attack them. But none of these kind of things that we do to ourselves. And he said, in India, if I could say, I can come in and wave with a magic wand and eliminate all of these top 10 diseases, they would say, oh, what a perfect society you live in. Okay, now in the United States, we have eliminated those things, but are we happy? Instead, we're doing exactly what you say. We're abusing our freedom. The phrase I like to use is ordered desires, ordered desires. And you talked about the right living, Doctor, where sex is a good thing, and I don't know if smoking is a good thing, but most of those things, they have eating is a good thing. Eating way too much is a bad thing, And the key is finding that balance between freedom and, what was the other word you used? Freedom and happiness. And it's hard to be human. It's hard to be free. It's actually easier if somebody controls all of those things. But we call that childhood. We don't ever grow up. And when we grow up, then we have to come up with those things for ourselves. And the more free you are, the more risky it is, and the more people tend to abuse it. And I guess what strikes me as a Christian is that God tends to tilt toward human freedom, because he certainly lets us do all sorts of things that damage ourselves. Doesn't want it, doesn't please him. He says this is the way to live, but he allows us the freedom to disobey. When we disobey, we're the ones who suffer. Good insight.
Other questions? There's a question over there from that gentleman.
Right. Yeah, I'd like to ask about how happiness relates to truth. Well, your worldview obviously is Christian, but as you've said, you see many servants or people serving, say, the leprosy, or even in war zones or whatever, and they might find happiness, but not necessarily they are Christians.
Right.
So, how does happiness relate to truth then?
Mm-hmm.
Must it only be a Christian that can find true happiness? Or
I know, Doctor, you have to leave in just a few minutes, so I would love to have you respond. I'll be glad to give. We Christians have a phrase called common grace. And what it means is if you live in this way, you will be better off, always. And that's true of societies. If a society is just, if a society is honest, so you don't have to count your change all the time, if society is based on trust, that's a good, freedom, that's a good society. And we've all seen what happens when you have societies that try to take that freedom away. It's no accident that human rights and emphasis on human freedom and democracy came out of a Christian background, because, as I said, God also entrusted us with that freedom. But freedom only works if you have responsible people, and that is our job as Christians. Surely those qualities do not have to have a Christian foundation. You don't have to be a Christian. So, some of the best people I know do not share my beliefs as a Christian, but they are generous and they are compassionate, and they are better off, as well as the people that they are helping. So most of Jesus' principles, and I think, Professor, you would say most of Buddha's principles would apply whether the person is a follower of Buddha or Jesus or not. These are principles for right living. And how does it relate to truth? As a Christian, I believe that I can point in the Bible to how those are revealed over time, revealed truths that as a Christian I get from the Bible. But if you study other religions, you find that others, like the Buddha, have come up with quite parallel beliefs, and they end up at the same place. Instead of being frenetic, you should take some time. You should meditate. You should pause. You should be mindful. Instead of ripping off other people, you should be honest and treat them with dignity. Instead of killing people, you should love people. You know, some basic things that you can find in other belief systems in Christianity.
Questions. There's a lady there with a hand very high up in the middle. Can you get to her?
Thank you. Mr. Yancey, I would like to know, do you agree that every suffering is for greater happiness or greater meaning? If not all, then what does the other sufferings do then for the world?
You do want me to talk about pain and suffering. All right. No, every suffering is not for happiness, for sure. But what we believe as Christians is that even the bad things that can happen can be transformed into good things. It's a little bit like fertilizer. You know, nobody likes it, it smells, but it can actually help you grow. And surveys among Christians and surveys among other people as well, show that if you ask people, what was the most spiritually meaningful time of your life? What was your time of greatest growth? 80% of people talk about a difficult time. It may be economic difficulty. It may be going to university before an exam, you know. But later you can look back and say, oh boy, those were great days. Or even people in the army, you know, seeing people die, you know, or the Blitz in London. Here is, in a nutshell, my understanding of pain and suffering. I do not believe that there is a God who is up there choosing, like for instance, I rolled off a cliff, my car turned over 5 times, I ended up with a broken neck, almost died. I don't think God was up there, oh, I'll teach Philip a lesson. You know, I don't think so. But I do believe as a Christian that out of any of those bad things that happen, good can come. And what we're called to do, we tend to want to look backwards. We tend to want to say, why did that happen? And even in the Bible, when people were with Jesus, they would want to know, why was this man born blind? You know, why did the tower fall on these 18 people? And Jesus always avoided that question. In fact, he would say, are you ready if it happens to you? Look forward. This man is blind, but the works of God can be made manifest in him. And sometimes that is manifest through remarkable things, recoveries and healings that happen. But more often, the works of God are the things that develop it, that we can allow God to develop in us, even in the midst of those difficult times. And I was joking down in Malaysia. In the New Testament, when it talks about suffering, it says you should be grateful for your suffering because it produces good qualities. Qualities like patience, forbearance, hope, compassion, those kind of qualities. And I said, well, how do you learn patience? In Indonesia, we had these people who had police cars in front of them, and they go whisking through. All the rest of us are stuck in traffic for hours. And I think, oh, that must be a very important person. And they laughed and said, no, they just paid off the police, and the police are doing this, you know. That person will never learn patience because they never have to wait in line, you know. So I said, think of Queen Elizabeth. Are you still in the Commonwealth? I can't remember. Are you? Yeah, okay. You're queen, yeah. Okay. Think of Queen Elizabeth. She seems like a very nice lady, but I don't know, how does she learn patience? She never has to stand in line. She always carries a pocketbook, but there's nothing in it. She has no cash. She never has to pay for anything, and she always waits for, you know, everybody waits for her to talk. Nobody ever interrupts her. Well, God, knowing that Queen Elizabeth would have this difficulty, gave her her children, and now she has learned patience. But you know, it's just. But I think that's why it's like fertilizer, things that we don't want to happen, and I personally don't feel comfortable saying this is why they happened. I don't see that in the Bible. But now that it has happened, good can be made out of it. That's the paradigm I see.
There's a question right at the back there. Yes.
You are still in the Commonwealth, huh? No, you're not. Oh, okay.
Mr. Yancey, you mentioned that the reason that brought you back to religion is that you want to know whom to thank when you feel grateful. I just wonder, why is it necessary to know somebody to thank, or have individualized or personalized a figure to thank? Being grateful is a very important element to achieve happiness, and for a lot of non-Christians, and they all they feel grateful to very occasion from time to time, and then they also feel touched by the nature's beauty and the beauty of music. In the recent a talk by Alan de Botton in TED, he suggested the atheist 2.0, which is to adapt the Christian religious form and tradition, but to offer opportunity for belief outside the Christian system. I just wonder what you think about that.
Yes. Yes, I think he's on to something, actually, Alain de Botton. I think he's Swiss, and he's one of the non-militant new atheists, Atheist 2.0. And what he says is, instead of fighting Christians, instead of making fun of them like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins have done, we actually have a lot to learn from them. So, for example, Christians are very good, he says, at creating community. And my brother, I mentioned my brother, my brother goes to an atheist church, and they sing songs, and they have a sermon, and that's kind of where we started with the question about common grace. I think gratitude is a very good thing for anybody, no matter, and I think community is a very good thing. Studies show if you have a community of support around you, you're so much better off if something bad happens. It's hard for me to be grateful to an inanimate object or to some nebulous, whatever, ground of being or whatever. I believe what's most important to me comes in personhood. So love is a person-to-person thing, and not even a lot of scientists don't agree with this, but when I look at the beauties of the world, and I think of it not so much as an engineer, but as an artist, I want to know the artist who designed the world. I could go on and on about that, but it's a choice that we make in light of evidence. And when I read the scientists themselves, there's one top scientist in the United States, Francis Collins, wrote a book called The Language of God. It was the #1 New York Times bestseller. And he knows that a lot of scientists don't believe in God, but he just mentioned some of the things that would have to happen. I was with a group of Nobel Prize winners. There were 3 of them. They had all won a Nobel Prize. They were all atheists. They were all Jewish. And the reason they were atheists is because they had an unfortunate experience growing up, and they just didn't want anything more to do with religion. And I had just read from an atheist that he had calculated the odds of this Earth with exactly the proportion of oxygen and nitrogen and carbon and all of that, this Earth coming completely random with no outside force at 1 in 10 to the 60th power, which is more than all the stars in the universe. And he believes that happened. It was just a random accident. And so I went to these scientists and I said, those are pretty strong odds. 1 in 10 to the 60th, do you really believe that? And they said, yes, we do. I said, well, boy, that sounds like faith to me. And it's easier for me to believe that there is a God bigger than the universe who just spun off the universe out of love, because the God is a creative God, and I want to know that God. Not everyone believes, I know that. But, of course, many Christians would tell you, part of the reason they believe is a conversion experience. I had one when I wasn't even seeking it. I felt sought by God. And I don't know why my brother did not and I did, but I have found it to be the most transforming experience of my whole life.
I think we have time for one last very quick question. So, There's a lady here.
Your very first point is that happiness should be grounded in reality. And you use examples like, boxer shorts makes you look very macho. But what about, so how do you deal with things that you want to see happen but is not yet reality? How do you deal with those?
For example,
For example, my husband is not behaving the way I want him to. Not just like, but should I give up hope or should I give up expectations on him? Or, this is a very, it's a very low-level question. So the thing is, how do you pray? As in, like, no obvious and model answer was, oh, you pray about it, yeah? But sometimes, how do you pray about it? Sometimes I think, how should I pray about it? It's out of my control. It's not yet reality. Should I not pray about it?
Right. Well, Jenna and I have been married for 45 years. Okay. And I'm sure there have definitely been times when both of us kind of wished we were not married. And yet, interestingly, as we look back over those are the things that sealed us together. Those hard times that we wanted to run away from, but they forced us not to run away. And that's what seals love. And how do I pray about these things? I'll give you a phrase from a British detective writer. You may know her, Dorothy Sayers, who wrote the Lord Peter Wimsey series. She also wrote books of theology. And I find that those two go together. They're both kind of whodunits, And she says, life is not a problem to be solved, but a work to be made. Life is not a problem to be solved, but a work to be made. And if you view your life as an engineer views life, okay, my toilet's broken. If I change this screw, if I redo this bulb, whatever, then I will fix my toilet. That's how engineers view life. That's the way toilets work. It's not the way humans work, And it's more like a work of art. And we all start with a whole different set of raw materials. Some are beautiful, some are not so beautiful. Some are really brilliant, some are not so smart. But you're all in the university, so you're smart, Some have charming personalities, some do not. And the goal is not to, let's all be exactly the same. The goal is to allow, with God's help, to create a beautiful work of art out of the set that you have been given. And that does include sometimes living with a husband that you would just as soon kick out, Jenna could tell you stories. It includes things we don't like about ourselves. I joke about my hair, whenever I come to Asia. Wouldn't it be great to have black, shiny, sleek, straight Asian hair, but that's not going to change, So just get used to it. And later looking back, I kind of like, for a while there, we had afros in the NBA. Then they all shaved their heads. Now it's kind of coming back, and I've been outliving them all this time. So that's it. It's not a problem to be solved that we can fix everything we don't like about ourselves or other people or life. But it is a work to be made. And both the Buddhist perspective and Christian, we're really telling how to make a work of art out of our own lives. And we Christians rely more strongly on believing we need God's help to do that. But the goal in both cases is right living, because it's good for us. And if everybody was doing that, it would be a very different world.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Philip Yancey. Thank you all for coming.